The air is thick, not just with the dry dust of the Sonoran Desert, but with the suffocating weight of history suddenly accelerated. A colossal, metallic bird, chartered and unmarked, sits silent on the tarmac of a small, discreet airport deep in Mexico's interior. Its cargo is not commerce or diplomatic personnel, but human beings whose journey ended not in a promised land, but in an abrupt, final rejection. The engines whine to life. A low, predatory growl that is the sound of a geopolitical order fundamentally shifting under our feet. This is not merely repatriation. This is Mexico declaring itself the world's border patrol, launching deportation flights that span entire continents. Watch until the final minute, because the destinations of these planes will shock you and fundamentally alter how you view global migration forever. If you think this massive enforcement effort is just about the U.S. border, you need to subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Tell us in the comments immediately, do you believe the U.S. is secretly funding this radical new Mexican strategy? The paradigm has violently shifted, silent but undeniable, along the 2,000 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. For decades, Mexico was primarily seen as the necessary, often reluctant, transit corridor, a porous nation traversed by countless millions dreaming of the North. That era has been violently extinguished, replaced by a strategic, cold reality, where the Mexican state, driven by intense diplomatic pressure and a complex calculation of its own sovereignty, now acts as the formidable gatekeeper. This new policy, spearheaded by the National Migration Institute, IMN, supported by the deployment of additional National Guard troops to both the southern and northern borders, signifies a profound recalibration of priorities. Mexico is no longer simply processing asylum seekers or managing temporary humanitarian aid. It is enacting immediate, large-scale removals that leverage charter air travel for unprecedented efficiency. The goal is clear: to stop the flow long before migrants even sight the Rio Grande, transforming Mexico's internal territory into the definitive endpoint of the North American journey. The move to immediate deportation, FLOT's a logistical undertaking previously, dominated almost entirely by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE is a muscular display of state capacity and a clear message to Washington. Mexico is asserting its sovereign authority over its own territory, even as it fulfills the de facto role of a partner in border security. But it does so on its own terms and with its own rapidly developing infrastructure. The utilization of these chartered flights allows the Mexican government to bypass the slower, more complex land repatriation protocols, especially for migrants who originate from outside the immediate Central American region. This action is a direct consequence of the massive surge in extracontinental migration, with thousands of individuals from places like Venezuela, Ecuador, and increasingly, countries far removed from the Western Hemisphere, utilizing complex global travel routes to reach the southern border. The pressure on Mexican shelters and resources had become untenable, forcing a brutal calculation where humanitarian concerns were outweighed by the sheer logistical necessity of national capacity management. This strategic pivot required immense financial and political investment, focusing domestic resources on border containment rather than on the social programs initially championed by the administration. In the secure operations centers across Washington, D.C., the reaction to Mexico's new hyper-aggressive stance is a tapestry woven with relief and deeply rooted geopolitical anxiety. The U.S. government, particularly during periods of intense domestic focus on border security and a surge in enforcement measures, views any successful deterrent action by its southern neighbor as a welcome stabilization of the crisis at its own doorstep. This reduction in border encounters, an immediate political win for U.S. enforcement agencies, allows Washington to claim success in managing the inflow without the full political liability of having executed the most dramatic expulsions itself. Yet this watching is far from passive acceptance. It is a tense monitoring of a subordinate becoming a highly autonomous and potentially unreliable partner. The U.S. strategy relies heavily on Mexico's continued compliance, particularly through agreements that see certain non-Mexican migrants return to await their U.S. court dates. But Mexico's unilateral decision to launch its own wide-ranging deportation flights, sometimes including migrants the U.S. was preparing to expel, shows a new, independent muscle memory. This independence is crucial, as the searches have indicated that moments of friction, such as Mexico's occasional refusal to allow U.S. military deportation flights to land, punctuate the cooperation. These refusals serve as strategic points of leverage for the Mexican government, a constant reminder to Washington that Mexico is not merely an extension of the Department of Homeland Security, but a sovereign nation with its own national interests and diplomatic priorities. The U.S. watches, scrutinizing the process for any procedural violations or international backlash that could ultimately destabilize their shared border management goals. The delicate balance of this relationship is constantly tested by domestic political narratives in both countries. Where the border remains a flashpoint, U.S. officials must publicly commend Mexican efforts while privately ensuring that this newfound independence does not translate into a failure to maintain deterrent pressure on the flow of migrants from the south. The cooperation is deep, often involving shared intelligence, equipment like biometric screening tools provided by the U.S., and coordinated troop deployments, but the strategic decision-making authority is visibly being reclaimed by Mexico City in a calculated bid for geopolitical status. The logistics of these immediate deportation flights worldwide are staggering, painting a picture of an immense, cold, bureaucratic machinery working with relentless, impersonal efficiency. These are not the short hops across the river to Central American nations. The title implies, and recent reporting confirms, that the destinations now include nations in South America, the Caribbean, and even increasingly distant points in Africa and Asia, a truly global reach for a nation traditionally focused on its immediate neighbors. The operational complexity involves securing landing rights, coordinating with consular officials from dozens of nations, and processing thousands of individuals whose legal status is determined in rapid, often opaque administrative procedures. For the migrants themselves, the experience is often a terrifying blur, a final definitive rejection after months or years of treacherous travel. They are collected from overcrowded detention centers in border states like Chiapas and Sonora, loaded onto buses, and then transferred onto the waiting aircraft. The psychological toll is devastating, the smell of jet fuel replacing the scent of jungle humidity, the sterile confines of the cabin replacing the dust and heat of the road. This abrupt termination of hope, often without access to due process or adequate legal consultation, is the core of the human cost. Migrants originating from countries such as Ghana, Mauritania, or Uzbekistan, who have spent fortunes and risked their lives crossing the Darien Gap, now find themselves on a transcontinental flight back to a reality often worse than the one they fled. These individuals represent the furthest reaches of the modern global migration phenomenon, and their immediate expulsion from Mexico sends a clear, chilling signal back along the international trafficking routes. The Americas are closing, and the journey is likely to end in aerial repatriation. This scale of operation demands a constant rotation of aircraft and specialized personnel, turning the process into a production line of human returns. The speed is the key operational component, designed not just for efficiency but for maximum deterrent effect, minimizing the time for legal challenges or local political organizing to take root. This relentless pace ensures that the fear of immediate return is propagated through the migrant communication networks, hoping to stem the flow before it begins. The financial cost of chartering these international flights is immense, suggesting either significant self-funding by the Mexican government or, more controversially, hidden financial mechanisms and non-monetary assistance being provided by partner nations, including the United States, to subsidize the cost of their mutual border control objectives. The launching of immediate deportation flights on a worldwide scale by Mexico ripples out across the entire international system, signaling profound changes for global human mobility and the criminal networks that profit from it. The primary immediate effect is on the human smuggling cartels, which must now fundamentally reevaluate their business model. Their promise of a pathway to the U.S. is immediately undermined when the endpoint for their clients becomes a flight straight back to their country of origin, drastically reducing the perceived success rate of the journey and thus the price they can demand. However, these criminal organizations are highly adaptable. Rather than collapsing, they will likely shift their routes and tactics, possibly seeking new, more dangerous passages or leveraging internal Mexican corruption to secure temporary sanctuary for migrants trying to avoid the airlifts. The routes through Central America and the perilous Darien Gap will not simply vanish, but they will become increasingly risky and expensive, leading to even more desperate measures by those determined to reach the north. This policy, while effective in reducing border numbers, often intensifies the vulnerability of the migrants who remain in transit. On the geopolitical stage, this new muscular approach elevates Mexico's status as a critical strategic player in the global migration system, moving it beyond a purely regional concern. By taking on the role of a massive expeller of third-country nationals, Mexico positions itself as a central pillar of Western border security, a move that demands respect, concessions, and increased economic investment from the United States and other developed nations. This diplomatic leverage is a significant asset, allowing Mexico City to negotiate from a position of strength on trade, economic aid, and domestic political stability. The long-term implications are tied to the concept of safe third-country agreements, even if not formally signed or universally applied. Mexico's robust deportation regime essentially makes it a de facto safe third country, aggressively returning asylum seekers and migrants before they ever reach the U.S. asylum system. This strategy creates a precedent that other transit nations may be pressured to follow, potentially leading to a cascading effect of border closures across the Western Hemisphere and a significant reduction in legal pathways for protection, fundamentally redefining the international right to seek asylum. The silent observing U.S. is acutely aware that this Mexican action is doing the work that U.S. law and international condemnation might otherwise prevent them from doing themselves, solidifying a joint, if complex, enforcement front that now extends from the southern tip of the Darien to the furthest reaches of international air travel. The harsh glare of the hangar lights caught the dust motes swirling in the stagnant, recycled air, making them look like a galaxy of forgotten wishes for the 80 souls crammed into the back of the enormous, chartered aircraft. This final moment was the cruelest irony of their epic journey, having traversed continents on foot and by sea. They were now airborne, moving faster than ever, but traveling definitively backward. The metal shell of the plane offered no comfort, only the cold, unyielding finality of their failure to breach the North American dream, a failure now cemented by the efficiency of Mexican logistics. Each face was a study in exhaustion, despair mingling with a flicker of defiant resignation, recognizing the immense power of the state apparatus that had finally trapped them. The young man from Senegal, whose vibrant orange travel shirt was now faded and torn, stared blankly at the bolted cabin floor, recalling the brutal, sun-baked transit across the North African deserts and the terrifying voyage across the Atlantic, all for a 7-hour flight that nullified his entire trajectory. The memory of the oppressive heat of the shelters and the incessant high-pitched noise of the detention centers in Chiapas had been replaced by the drone of the engines, an equally inescapable soundtrack to his irreversible return. His neighbor, a woman from Haiti who had carried her infant daughter through the treacherous, muddy paths of the Darien, clutched the child tightly, the small body a meager source of warmth against the chill of the cabin. She remembered the precise moment of capture, the quick, decisive movement of the green-uniformed Mexican National Guard soldiers, their faces impassive beneath their helmets. There had been no lengthy interrogation, no opportunity for an appeal to mercy, only the immediate, mechanized processing that stamped her file with the immutable word, return. The child, oblivious, was a living testament to a journey whose sacrifices now seemed utterly meaningless. The starkness of the plane's interior utilitarian seating, no windows near the back, only the faint, clinical smell of disinfectant, served as a sensory cage, a brutal contrast to the rich, earthy smells of the jungle and the open sky they had navigated. This was the highly polished, corporate face of mass deportation, a spectacle of efficiency designed to send a powerful, unambiguous message. The absence of traditional U.S. markings on the aircraft offered Mexico the necessary political shield, allowing its government to claim ownership of the enforcement action, even as the ultimate beneficiaries of this order were clearly recognized as the policy architects in Washington. The flight manifest, a closely guarded document, detailed a dizzying array of origin points, names from India, Cameroon, China, and Venezuela, all converging at a nexus point in Mexico, only to be dispersed globally once more. This global sweep demonstrated the sheer extent of Mexico's commitment to its new role, a commitment fueled by a need to ease pressure on its internal systems and, crucially, to maintain a working relationship with the aggressively anti-migration administration in the United States. This strategic sacrifice of the humanitarian ideal for the sake of political pragmatism was the core tragedy playing out thousands of feet above the clouds. Meanwhile, back on the border, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection (CBP) observed the results with a cool, professional detachment. The official line was one of limited comment, recognizing Mexico's sovereign right to manage its own migration flows, but the internal memos undoubtedly tracked the declining apprehension numbers with satisfaction. The less chaos on the U.S. side of the fence, the greater the political stability for the administration, regardless of the method employed by their partners south of the line. The cooperation, however, was a constant, tense negotiation, particularly as the Mexican government occasionally pushed back against U.S. demands, such as the recent refusal to allow certain military aircraft, carrying deported persons who were not of Mexican origin, to land. This strategic refusal was a careful assertion of dominance, a way for President Sheinbaum's administration to show its base and the international community that it was not merely a pawn in Washington's game. It was a calculated risk that Mexico was willing to take to protect its long-term political interests, even while broadly maintaining the necessary deterrent function. The financial and intelligence support that flows from the U.S. to Mexican enforcement agencies is a complex web of shared interests, making the distinction between Mexican policy and U.S. requested outcome increasingly blurred. American funding for border infrastructure, training for the INM, and the provision of advanced surveillance technology allow Mexico to effectively conduct these large-scale operations. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement where the U.S. gets the border control it demands, and Mexico receives economic leverage and recognition as a key global security partner. This covert, yet deep, collaboration ensures that the air traffic control systems, the logistical coordination, and even the manifest vetting procedures for the worldwide deportation flights are synchronized, creating a nearly seamless deportation pipeline. The irony is palpable. The very country that many migrants saw as their last chance for a temporary stop before the U.S. is now acting as the final, most brutal checkpoint, ensuring their journey ends not in El Paso or San Diego, but thousands of miles away in the city they risked everything to escape. The logistical challenges of returning a migrant from Eritrea or Bangladesh are vastly different and exponentially more complex than those involved in sending someone back to Guatemala. The Mexican government must navigate international aviation laws, secure clearances in politically sensitive or war-torn regions, and ensure the basic safety of the deportees once they land, which is an immense burden. This necessity to coordinate with distant governments transforms Mexico's Interior Ministry into a far-reaching diplomatic arm, dedicated almost entirely to the politics of human removal. The use of charter flights to these distant global destinations avoids the potential for international lawsuits and humanitarian blockades that might plague a slower, more visible land deportation system. By making the removals swift and aerial, the Mexican government minimizes the media exposure and the time available for advocacy groups to intervene, ensuring that the process is streamlined to an almost military degree of efficiency. This speed, while logistically impressive, is what magnifies the human cost, denying individuals the vital days or weeks needed to organize a final legal plea or contact family members.